Welcome back. Now, while it is unknown whether the new crop of leaders will deliver lasting prosperity, the global economic climate should improve in 2025. This as it increasingly untethers from tight financial conditions, election cycle angst, and the strains from geo-economic fragmentation. Earlier, I caught up with Standard Bank Group Chief Economist Goolam Ballim for a perspective on the year ahead. I started off by asking him whether Donald Trump 2.0 has ushered in a new economic regime. Here's that conversation.
The Trump administration certainly is upending the global order as we've known it for around 7 decades, and at multiple fronts. So certainly I think we must embrace 2025 with the view that geopolitical, geo-economic, trade relationships, investment flows, and even people mobility could be affected by the flurry of policy choices that Donald Trump is making.
I mean, you spoke about the K economy. Just talk to me about that, because I do understand that there is an echo from the COVID-19 era, but also seeming that that is continuing with, Donald Trump amid his policies. What does that entail?
But the K economy, what we refer to is that you have this gains in personal wealth amongst wealthy individuals, whereas low-income individuals and even the middle class tend to see diminishing prosperity. And this has been happening for several years. In other words, it has been widening, hence the suggestion of a K, where quite simply put, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But then politicians enter the fray, and under the broad umbrella of populism will promise poor individuals riches if they elect them and they subscribe to their economic policies. And in recent years, we've seen this has given birth to big men politics, where charismatic leaders thrive on their popularity, get embraced by society, and then remake policy with the idea that it will deliver riches. We're not sure that the policy choices that the American administration is making will actually yield results. If anything, I would argue that America, for all of its entrepreneurial strengths as an empire, it could see its empire hasten in decline under the Trump administration.
It's quite interesting because, I mean, when you talk about this K economy and the divergence between the rich and the poor, it would also seem that with Trump's policies, that could be happening with countries as well, and particularly with the US really trying to cement its dominance. But you say that that might not work over time. But in the short term, could we see that divergence between the countries? But also, where do new shifts in global alliances lie, particularly when you look at the alliance of BRICS?
So 2 things stand out. In the United States, for some time now, the rich have been getting richer on the notion of a winner-takes-all ideology. Shared prosperity is not really imbued in the American makeup. And in fact, you could argue that the middle class today have about the same real income as they did in the 1980s, adjusted for prices. So America, in an attempt to reset the inter-income strand challenges, is going to find it quite arduous. And the policy choices that Donald Trump is pursuing of, in a sense, building a wall around the United States is likely to come back to haunt America. In effect, the policy choices that Donald Trump is adopting is a form of Brexit. And like the United Kingdom, in time people could come again to regret it. In terms of international relationships, the weaponizing of trade and the weaponizing of the dollar has already been a feature of American international relationships for some time. As a consequence, it's unsurprising that 8 of the world's 10 fastest growing trade corridors exclude the United States. However, many of them do have China as a terminus. So many of the nations that are feeling assailed by the United States are increasingly building trade and investment relationships with nations that are more globally minded, even if it's at the expense and exclusion of the United States.
Yeah. You talk about this weaponization of trade, and of course, we have seen that over the last few days with South Africa also being in the firing line, where our own trade relationship with the US might be threatened. Of course, that remains to be seen if there will be an impact on South Africa's inclusion on AGOA. But I mean, just with that, because obviously we have to look at the political economy as well. We are also dealing with the GNU and a mood lift on that front. And there have been many people who have, I guess, flagged risks to divergences in policies within GNU. But with this kind of US fighting with the rest of the world, including South Africa, do you think that actually that might wipe out the risks of the GNU fragmenting and actually make it stronger?
I do think the GNU is increasingly founded on very stable fundamentals locally. I think key politicians embedded in that 10-person political party assembly are committed to the idea. So I think we'll continue to see it congeal quite strongly with respect to South Africa. In terms of international relationships, I don't think there's anything that's materially going to threaten the GNU. If anything, what we've seen cursory attempts by the politicians within the Government of National Unity to establish a single mantra and to show some solidarity with regard to expressing South Africa's position around key areas like land expropriation, which is constitutionally founded and historically just. So I don't think that the United States assailing South Africa necessarily is going to imperil the Government of National Unity.
Yeah, and actually just the impact of the GNU on the economy, what do you think that looks like? Looking at the fact that we have seen, I mean, in our own stock markets, the JSE having a mood lift there where the boat of the GNU, or rather the high tide of the GNU lifted all boats there. But just looking at how, the stock market particularly is performing, do you think that there has been a fundamental shift, or the re-rating was just a temporary thing and maybe we're just waiting for a little bit more?
So politics is everything.
Yeah.
It's the bedrock of confidence. South Africa seems to be emerging from a decade of impugning politics, and there is a semblance now that the political landscape is beginning to settle, and that settlement can engender lower domestic uncertainty and promote efficiencies. Broadly, we talk about the reform agenda.
Yes.
So in this respect, politics to confidence and confidence to risk-taking seems to be the path and direction of travel of South Africa. So the Government of National Unity is an essential element in South Africa's recovery, its acceleration in GDP growth. And again, with respect to the politics and the macroeconomic reforms that the President, along with other members of the Government of National Unity, are now engendering, the direction of travel is constructive, and for the first time in many years.
Yeah. I was actually looking at your economic growth forecast for South Africa, and I mean, I guess the low-hanging fruit, not the low-hanging fruit, but the minimum growth figure that we have for a sustainable economy is 3%. And I noticed in the forecast that up until 2028, it's actually goes until 2.4%. And I'm wondering, because you talk about the reform agenda, and also we had a State of the Nation address that was rather practical. But what stands in the way of where we are now and reaching that 3%, particularly in the next 3 years?
The functional bedrock of an economy is its infrastructure. And these capital items would be human capital, physical capital, and financial capital. And how those items coalesce around innovation is what generates growth. Investment in South Africa has been falling in terms of its share of GDP for more than a decade, and it's now a very pedestrian 15% of GDP. South Africa needs investment thrust. It needs an investment bonanza if we're going to get to, say, 3% plus sustainable economic growth. And that investment uptick needs to emanate both from the public sector in terms of public goods investment or public goods infrastructure, and the private sector investing in private sector stock, but at the same time also being crowded into providing public goods alongside the public sector. So there is a potential premised on confidence that South Africa is going to have a robust and enduring political cycle that can then encourage the animal spirits to participate and resurrect South Africa's investment landscape, which then will serve to trigger elevated consumer demand, consumer spending.
You talk about investment being the foundation of economic growth, but you also made a link between investment and the rule of law. What is that picture looking like in South Africa right now?
For the last decade, many data points suggest that the rule of law has been incinerating, and it therefore makes sense that with that lack of commensurate confidence and uncertainty, the investment cycle has been stuttering and hesitant. Now there is a sense that the guardrails are being reinserted into South African society, guardrails that control public finances, that reduce the excesses of politicians and the administration, guardrails that simply enhance the judiciary, prosecutorial entities, and perhaps even the police services. If these improve, they temper uncertainty, they enhance efficiency. So the rule of law, one can argue, is being remade from a weak point, low base, and that could then engender, and is engendering, some recovery in the investment cycle, speaking to hopefully perpetually growing or expanding trend growth.
That was Goolam Ballim, Chief Economist and Head of Research at the Standard Bank Group.